Good evening. I'm Gavin Cleespees, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm happy to welcome you here. We have a reasonable crowd in the audience. I know we have about 200 people signed up online, so I'd also like to thank all the people who are joining us virtually. The Massachusetts Historical Society is an independent nonprofit organization. We maintain a research library with an amazing collection of material. We hold close to 14 million manuscript pages within our collections that include the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents. For the past 232 years, we've made our collections and our material available to the public free of charge. We also host a wide variety of programs, and we have a number of great things coming up in the next couple of months. In the coming weeks, we are hosting a 4-program series exploring disability history. This is our second series exploring disability history. And it will kick off this coming Wednesday with a program titled Disability in the American Past, Disappeared Disabilities, that explored famous people who had disabilities that have not been remembered. This will include Sojourner Truth, John F. Kennedy, Thomas Edison, Harriet Tubman, and more. And then just to lighten the mood a little bit on Valentine's Day, we'll also be hosting a gallery talk, which will explore the love letters between John and Abigail Adams. We're only able to host programs like this thanks to the support of our members and donors. So if you enjoy the program this evening, we hope that you'll come back for more, and we hope that you'll consider supporting MHS. This evening, we're happy to welcome Ilyon Woo. Ms. Woo is a researcher and author. Her writing has appeared in the Boston Globe and the Wall Street Journal, and she's received support for her research from the National Endowment for the Humanities and American Antiquarian Society, among other institutions. She holds undergraduate degree in humanities from Yale College and a PhD in English from Columbia University. And this evening, she'll be discussing her new book, Master Slave, Husband, Wife, which explores the amazing story of William and Ellen Krafts, a couple who escaped slavery through daring, determination, and disguise. She will be joined in conversation by Dean Grodzins, who is a senior researcher and case writer for the Case Method Institute for Education and Democracy. He's been a lecturer in history and literature at Harvard University, professor of history at Meadville Lombard Theological School, and a senior researcher at Harvard Business School. He is the author of American Heretic, Theodore Parker, and Transcendentalism, as well as many articles and book chapters. He's also a former MHS fellow. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guests.
Well, I'm so glad to get to talk to you in this way. We met about 3 years ago when you wrote to me to ask me questions about Theodore Parker, who knew the Krafts and worked with them, and so we became friends in this kind of echo of a friendship for 170 years ago.
Yeah, somebody asked at one point, how did you meet each other? And I was like, well, through mutual friends from a long time ago, like a very long time ago.
So I'm delighted to welcome you now as a New York Times bestselling author, because so I thought we'd talk for a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions from people, whatever is on your mind about this book or this story. So I thought we could start with talking a bit about who the Krafts were, and a little about what drew you to them initially to write about them.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I just want to thank the Massachusetts Historical Society for bringing us all here today. This is an incredible archive, and I can't even count the number of sort of eureka moments that I had here. And I think we'll get to talk about some of these, like that were particularly attached to this project. But the magic really happens here as you put your hands into the papers that these people left behind. Papers written by William Krafts, for example, and Theodore Parker, these friends through whom we had the opportunity of meeting. And so thank you, Dean, for joining me here today. the story of the Krafts and how I found them was in a library, much like the one downstairs, a dark wood paneled library at Columbia University. And this is a moment that I've been made to recollect again and again these days, but it never tires me because I remember it as such an intense reading experience, like one of those that really just like I felt in my body, like the experience of reading these words, these really powerful words. And I mean, we're in a place that is like you are stewards of words here, right? At the MHS. And when I think about like Ellen and William Kraft being denied literacy, being denied the ability to read and to write, and then writing this incredibly powerful story that travels to us so immediately across all these years, and then leaving behind records for us to read again in the archives, that thrills me still. So that it began with that just feeling gripped by the story that they wrote about this adventure. Now, this adventure, it's like the way they tell it, it's like a picaresque narrative. It's like a conversion narrative. It's an adventure story. It's a fugitive slave narrative. It's a story about how they made this journey across over 1,000 miles as husband and wife, but disguised as master and slave.
Right. I mean, the book is called 1,000 Miles to Freedom, which they published in 1860. So, but when you were grabbed by it, and then what led you to say, I need to delve deeper into this story, go beyond what they wrote about themselves?
Well, that's a great question, because there is a big leap from, oh my gosh, the story is so gripping, to I want to write about the story. And there was actually probably a 20-year, I don't know if you want to call it a delay or a process or a journey.
You were busy.
But it was also, I don't think I would have been, I know I wasn't ready at that time 20 years ago. And it took me a while to decide I wanted to write it. I really kind of initially I wanted to read more about them. They offer this incredible narrative about their journey, and they offer a lot of specifics that are kind of like great breadcrumbs for us scholars to follow later on. But then there are all kinds of silences, gaps in what they say. And in the beginning, actually, in the preface to their narrative, they say, this is not our whole life story. We're just focusing on our journey. And so that led me to the question of, well, what happened before the journey? What sparked their journey? What sparked their imagination? What made it possible for them to even be able to conceive of this kind of idea? What was in their world? Who were the people in their world? Who did they leave behind? Who did they love? Who enslaved them? What was it like to be dressed as a man in this period versus a woman? I mean, like all these questions and more. So the narrative kind of piqued my curiosity, and then I started trying to delve into the mystery. I wasn't sure how much I would find, but that's when the archives, if they speak to you, that's where they come in.
So the book really, their book starts in December 1848, when they get this idea that Ellen who could pass for white, can disguise herself as a white man, and William can pretend to be his slave. And then using this ruse, they can take this leap into it seems like almost a leap into the dark to travel north, because neither of them can read, and there are all kinds of uncertainties on the schedule, and there are many ways many places that they could be challenged or discovered. So now tell us a little about the moment that decided, when you said, well, okay, we know that story, they told some of that story from their dramatic escape, and a little about what happened afterwards when they got to Boston, which they eventually did, and then had to flee again to England. But if you could talk a little bit about some of the sources that opened up the story to you.
Well, I guess first I would I would lay out the acts, right? So
Right.
the first act is the escape from Macon, Georgia to Philadelphia, to the north. And then the second act is in New England as they go on this abolitionist lecture circuit and become sort of media stars as they confront this crisis in Boston and slave hunters come after them in Boston, and then their flight again from America. So the Krafts narrative really focuses a lot heavily on that first piece, and that first piece meaning the journey.
Mhm.
So they offer a really packed sentence. It's one that you can pick apart endlessly, I think, in a literature class, but about the identity of basically Ellen's identity. It's something that everybody wanted to know as soon as they saw her, especially on the lecture circuit. They wanted to know, where did you come from? How did somebody as fair-skinned as yourself, this is white audiences who'd never seen somebody like Ellen, who was enslaved before, suddenly identifying with her on account of her pale complexion, wondering how she came to be a woman like this, as they said, came to be in bondage. So Ellen was the daughter of an enslaved woman named Maria and her biological father, who was her first enslaver. So that much she makes clear. That much they make clear in this 1860 narrative. And so there's this very tangled sentence where, and this is in the voice of William Kraft, where he says, you know, my wife's first master was her father. And then he talks about how the father had also a wife, and they don't go into the details of how all of this happened. They only say that when Ellen was 11 years old, she was given away as a wedding present to her own biological half-sister. And this was on account of her father's wife being so enraged by the sight of her and her resemblance to her biological father, and also other people mistaking Ellen for being a legitimate child of the family. She was so enraged by this that she gave her away as a wedding gift. So that much we know. We don't have the names of the enslavers. We don't have their histories. The father's wife has been sort of described by scholars as this almost like if you're looking at this as a twisted fairy tale, as like the wicked stepmother figure. But she is you don't know much about her. You know nothing about Ellen's mother more in the narrative. So those people are especially Ellen's mother, are ones I wanted to look for in the archives. I wanted to see, can we glimpse anything of this woman who at 18 became Ellen Kraft's mother? And that is one of the things that was early revealed when I went to Macon, because I found traces of Ellen's mother in the archives through this sort of wicked stepmother's and the biological father's papers. You see her only as a name and a number assigned to her, a value number and an age. But there was a little bit there, and I wanted to see if I could find more, which fortunately I was able to do.
Writing their stories, Ellen's story, Ellen's mother's story, William's story, because of the absence of material in the archives. These were people who were not considered important enough to archive their paper. Not that they would have papers, because they weren't allowed to read and write. So then how you face that challenge and try to overcome it in the book.
Yeah, that was a big challenge, because there is what senior Black scholars have described as this archival imbalance or deficit, right? Where you have the people of property have so much, and they have so many records as well on top of the property. And then the people who are enslaved and considered property, they're listed as property, and that's how they appear in the archives. So can we get more than a name? Can we get more than a number? That was a central challenge. And fortunately, in the Krafts case, because they chose to tell their story, they So they made this incredible escape to freedom, but then they actually became activists, and they took their story on the road, and they went public with their names, with their identities, with everything. And on account of this, we can find more about them than we can about others. That said, there is this imbalance. And I could tell you about Mistress Smith, the father's wife. I could tell you all about her family lineage. I could show you where she's buried, in fact, and you can find her on a virtual graveyard, and you can find him as well. You can find so many of these white enslavers. We don't know where Ellen Kraft is buried today, let alone her mother. We know where William Kraft is buried, but we don't have that same information for Ellen. So how do you tell a story when there's so much imbalance? I wanted to bring this woman, Mr. Smith, to life because I didn't want her to remain a caricature. I think it's too easy to caricaturize people and say, and that enables us to sort of hold them at an arm's distance. But Mr. Smith was not the only woman in this position. You know, this was this institution of slavery. It was nationwide. There were so many Mr. Smiths. So how to humanize this person and show the choices that she made as an individual? I wanted to bring that alive. And yet when you do that and you have nothing for Ellen's mother, I didn't want to replicate the very imbalance it was that I was trying to correct. So one thing that I tried to do was, on the level of writing and on the level of story, is to turn that axis around Ellen and her mother. So the enslavers may have all the stuff, and they may carry the footnotes, but there's a way to tell the story from Ellen's point of view, from her mother's point of view, and flesh out their world as much as possible, and really kind of getting there on the level of grammar as well, giving them ownership of each sentence, of each section of the story, of each chapter of the story. That helps, I think, turn that balance in another way.
I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about their experience up here in Boston. So here they make this incredible escape from slavery. And almost as soon as they are freed, they encounter William Wells Brown, the Black abolitionist William Wells Brown, who persuades them to go on tour with him. So they become celebrities overnight, only weeks out of slavery, which is kind of astonishing. This is in 1849. And then they have a reputation, particularly here in New England and Boston, and then they try to settle here. And then the Fugitive Slave Law passes. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about their experiences up here and what it was like coming up to New England.
Yeah, I mean, can you just imagine they were on this? I mean, they had experienced this lifetime of bondage, and then they're on this crazy journey. They become ill. Ellen actually becomes ill, physically ill after
it was so exhausting.
It
was, I mean, the tension that they had to carry while they were on that journey.
Yeah, so physically and psychically, it must have been exhausting. And yet, when they are invited to take their story on the road to help others left behind, they jump at it. You know, they don't go off to Canada, which was their original plan.
They don't fade into anonymity, which was a common thing that fugitives from slavery did. To be safe.
That would have been the safer thing. Risk. Yeah, they don't. I mean, William Wells Brown changed his name. Frederick Douglass changed his name. They don't change their names, and that puts them at additional risk. But in a way, they kind of have to do that because people are, from the beginning, they're questioning their story. It seems almost too, I mean, is this a ruse? Is this some kind of performance? Is this really real? So from the beginning, when they're telling their story on the road, they are getting peppered with questions. I mean, really grilled. So in a room like this, in a lecture hall, people will stand up and they'll have their own Q&A. And William Wells Brown realizes the Krafts are sort of their own best spokespeople. I mean, they're repeatedly described as being incredibly beautiful and charismatic and well-spoken. So he says, all right, ask them whatever questions you want. And so there's a volley back and forth of questions. People grill William, especially about Macon, like how are the streets? Who was on this corner? Like, prove to us that you actually lived here, people who had been there. And he just bats them right back. And people are amazed at this. There's one time actually when somebody asks, who was the governor of Georgia like 7 years ago? And that's one he doesn't know. And he freezes for a minute, but then somebody else from the audience shouts back, who was the governor of Massachusetts 7 years ago? And William has won over everybody, just as they won people over on their journey. They win crowds over in these halls. And so people are standing up with them and for them.
Mhm.
But
So,
I've lost the sight of your original question looking at these Krafts. Yeah.
no, so they spend time lecturing. You point out that they travel another 1,000 miles
Yes.
lecturing around New England.
By railroad too. I mean, that's where their crazy schedule comes from. I mapped that. I've created like so much obsessive mapping and outlining and timelining to reconstruct all this. You asked before about sources and things like that, but this was like a big strategy for me, and I am directionally challenged. So I especially needed those maps. So I was following them, and you see that they're following the railroad.
So then they decide they're going to stop.
Mhm.
And they're going to try to live a normal life. And then the Fugitive Slave Law comes along. Only a little over a year, it's fine after they try to settle down. So could you talk a little bit about that? Because one thing, since we're both historians and we like to geek out over sources, some of the sources that are here, that are on the cabinet over in the Dow's library, have to do with that period and what happens next.
Yeah. So, I mean, they can't catch their breaths, they've sort of just settled in. William is doing really well in his furniture.
He's a cabinet maker. And
he's not actually practicing cabinet making. He's sort of like fixing up furniture.
Okay.
And there's one scholar who suggested, because there's Northern prejudice here too, an attempt to keep these trades among white workers, that he couldn't find a job. I haven't found actually the documentary evidence for that, but that's one claim. But for whatever reason, he's not actually making the furniture. He's doing furniture repairs, and Ellen's learning upholstery. There's at least one claim that suggests that there might have been a child on the way, which is their long hoped for dream. And this is one of those things
I think that's actually worth emphasizing, because a driving force, as you pointed out, for them wanting to leave enslavement in the first place is their desire to start a family, and to start a family that is free from the threat of enslavement and what slavery can do to a family.
And free from the trauma that they themselves, we didn't talk about this, but it is in the book here, is that they suffered deeply from these separations as children. And so they didn't want to replicate that. So this is their big dream, is to have freeborn children. So we don't know exactly what's happening here, but even if Ellen wasn't actually pregnant, there was that possibility that they could have children who would at least be at some physical distance from Georgia. But that distance collapses with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. So there had been a Fugitive Slave Act before, as we know, from the 18th century, but that one, it said, lacked teeth, especially
it left a lot of the enforcement up to the states, and a lot of states were hesitant to cooperate fully,
or passed personal liberty laws to circumvent these the power of these people from the South to reach over. So technically they could do the reach, but what the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 did is Ibram Kendi describes it as octopus powers. So it's like it gave the slavers a mighty arm, and all kinds of reinforcements. So you could go now to a US commissioner, so not a state authority, but bypass the state and the local people to find yourself a US commissioner who could help you execute. And then you could raise a posse. And in fact, every good citizen was required. So if you and I were called in that period, doesn't matter who we were or what we stood for, we would also face punishment and
If
fines
we didn't join.
if
the
we didn't
posse.
join and
Right.
help. And so suddenly you have, Bostonians who might have been sort of at a distance from all this, some of them at least, thinking, wait a second, my own life, not life is on the line here, but my own choices are restricted here, is how they put it. And then people who were enslaved or who could be formerly enslaved or could be mistaken for being enslaved. Essentially, all Black people were under a huge risk now because there's no way to fight back. So if somebody says, you were my slave in Virginia, I don't have any ability to, I don't have legal recourse.
In the under the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850,
Yes.
the accused slave could not give testimony on his or her own behalf. That was one of the law rules. So this idea that there would be resistance and this fear that I mean, there were two aspects of this. One, that free people would be kidnapped into slavery, which which happened a lot.
Yeah.
The most famous case, if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, that's the most well-known, but it happened a lot.
And especially with children.
Yeah. And then there's the second question, which is some self-emancipated people being brought back to enslavement, which a lot of people felt objectionable, especially because it couldn't be proven. How can you prove that this is really the person if it's only the testimony of this outsider who's coming in and saying, this is I own this person. So there was this big resistance, and this is one of the reasons. So Parker comes into the story because they were attending his church, this radical Unitarians church in Boston. And he then helps organize the vigilance committee to protect them, protect all fugitives in Boston, essentially, from what was called kidnapping. So I don't know, could you talk about some of those there's these dramatic moments when these slave catchers authorized by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 arrive in Boston in the fall of 1850.
Yes. So up until this time, despite sort of the shame that has come, as Robert Collins puts it, or
Robert Collins
is Ellen Krafts' half-sister's wife. Husband. So the half-sister is legally the enslaver, but he demands to be called master. So he's talking about all these, just the riot of like having the story told all over the place, and it's embarrassing for him. But he hasn't done anything up until this point. The Fugitive Slave Act passes, and he sees this not just an opportunity for himself personally, but he sees this as a national matter. He is actually a union man. He believes in the United States. He's committed to the Union versus other fellow Southerners in his community who would have the South already succeed at this point.
Right.
And he says, no, we should stay together as a country. And I'm going to prove that the North will be good on its word by recapturing Ellen and William. So he says in these certain terms that this will be a test case for the Fugitive Slave Act. And he gets these two young men from Macon to act as his proxies and come up here, really not very far from where we're sitting right now. And they are in turn, a 20-minute walk away from where the Krafts are, but Boston is not a big city. And that's where the sort of what's described as like a, chess pieces moving, that whole thing begins. But what has happened before this is once the Fugitive Slave Act passes, Boston comes together, not all of it. There are definitely different factions, but there's a part of Boston that comes together. And this begins with the Black community at the African Meeting House, which you can also visit today. And there are people gathered there and speaking and against the outrages, evoking the Declaration of Independence, the spirit of rebellion that led to the founding of this nation, and saying, it's time to rise up now. And will you meet us? And then at Faneuil Hall, so they call for another meeting. And that's where there's a large multiracial gathering with thousands in attendance. And Frederick Douglass is summoned up again because he can speak like nobody else. And he rouses this crowd, and he engages in this call and response where people are saying, yes, we are going to stand up.
So, they eventually, the crowds managed to drive these slave catchers out of Boston. And then Parker legally marries the Krafts, because he says their marriage was already Christian, but I'm going to make it legal because they realize they're going to have to leave the country. And famously, well, it's described in the letter that's in the case over in the Dowse Library, and you describe it in your book too. But
yeah, there's so much back and forth. And I have to say, when I was writing this and I was again timelining, I was so excited, because the accounts that we get in the Krafts narrative, for example, they don't describe any of this crisis in Boston in their own words. They don't even talk about being on the abolitionist lecture circuit. They include a single letter from one white activist to another that kind of summarizes what happens. And what I did was use newspapers and diaries and archival materials here. And I created this crazy chart. So I had William actually I had them separately. William, Ellen, slave catchers, and these Robert Collins, the various players this way. I had time going this way. And then anything I found, I put into this outline. And then I could see where William and Ellen Craft were at any time, where the slave catchers were at any time, at any point in time. And that was super exciting for me. Unfortunately, when I wrote it down that way, it wasn't so exciting, apparently, because my editor was she's very, so I've had two editors and they're both wonderful. Dawn Davis was the first, and she said, I just remember the way she phrased it. She's like, this, that. They go this and they do that. They go here and they go there. And she said, it has to have the feeling of a caper. You got to make it kind of dance. This is not a caper. Basically, I had kind of buried it. And she said that from that section of the story, I had to cut 20 to 30 pages, which is a lot. So I had to really then find that arc. But so there is in the footnotes, you'll see all of this, that. But what I hope is a really exciting story arc.
Well, I mean, there's so many dramatic episodes. And one is that Ellen gets hidden in Peter Parker's house. He's right by his study on the top floor of his house. And so Parker is writing his sermons with a sword and a pistol on his desk. Or there's
the one here, right? The little book.
Little book. I wanted you to ask about that little book by Dr.
This little book is incredible. So this I actually found late in the game. I mean, really when I was supposed to be done with the book, and I'd actually written the whole scene, but I'll give you the scene. So Ellen and William Craft are hidden in different parts of the city. And basically everyone thinks that William Craft is going to die because he will not be captured alive. He's willing to do whatever it takes not to go back into bondage. And
he's well armed.
He is armed. He's armed. Ellen is hidden. And there's a doctor, Henry Ingersoll Bowditch, who decides, you know what? They're never going to get to see each other again. I want to give them this one last night. And I'm going to offer to drive William to see Ellen in her secret hiding place. So he takes his faithful steed, Fanny. So this is the level of detail you can actually uncover at places like this. His horse is named Fanny. And he goes to pick up William Craft. And he says, I will, I'll give you this ride. Do you want to go? And William says, yes, but on one condition. And he pulls out a pistol and he says, I got mine. Will you carry yours? And are you willing to use it? And that is a real moment when this doctor, you know, he has to make this choice. Is he willing to use force? Is he willing to put his own life on the line for this? And he says, like, basically he hears sort of the golden rule coming to him, like, you know, what would he do in his own situation if he were William Kraft? And he says, you know, if he were in that position, he would want somebody, he would stand up, and he says, I will join him. And so he's kind of like, you can feel it in the tone of the writing that is published, that's left behind, where he's a little bit kind of giddy, like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And they make it through the toll, and the Krafts are very briefly reunited, and I'll pause there for them. But what we don't know, and what I discovered, this was like sort of the secret that came up much later after I had written, like the draft is pretty much ready to go, but I was like, all right, just like one more peek into the archives. And I'm so glad that I did that, because there is this little tiny book. It's part of what is called the memorial cabinet that Dr. Bowditch leaves behind. And this is a memorial cabinet that he builds for his son, Nat, who died during the Civil War. And Nat died, actually, he didn't die immediately. Like, it's not like he died right on the battlefield. He died as a result of the illness. And actually his father ended up instituting ambulance reform, or like lobbying for ambulance reform that took place as a result of his son's death. Anyway, Dr. Bowditch was deeply grieving the son. And what I learned from this little book, which describes all these different objects that have something to do with his son, is that there was this gun, the gun that William Kraft had offered to Dr. Bowditch. And I thought, well, what does the gun have to do with Nat and this child? But what this tiny book, and you can hold it in your hands, reveals is that this child came along this journey, that Dr. Bowditch, when he knew that William Kraft was likely to die, and he wanted to give William and Ellen Kraft that last night together, he took his 10-year-old child with him, and he wanted to teach the son who would die in the Civil War an anti-slavery lesson that he would never forget. And so this child sat between his armed father and William Kraft as they drove on to have William reunited with Ellen. Now, we're really lucky to have all this information about Dr. Bowditch and about Nat. I wish we had the same information from William and Ellen Kraft's point of view, but you can see, at least, you know, in some of this, really the stakes, the life and death stakes, if not immediately from their point of view, then in their world.
Well, I mean, we could talk a lot more. I think I can say that they do get out of Boston. They do get out of Boston. Well, there's more in the book about that. But I thought that might be a good moment to sort of open it up and bring in questions, either in person, or if, I don't know who can see the online questions, but if
I'm Barbara Brown. I chair Hidden Brookline on slavery and freedom. So I'm especially glad to be here because she hidden Brookline briefly.
Yes, and I consulted with you previously, so it's.
I wanted everybody to know that the first Fugitive Slave Act was brought forward by our Senator George Cabot, who was a slave trader, as were several of his brothers. And that only last year did the Beverly Historical Society reckon with that. So this story and these stories are becoming more and more part of our life, which is just wonderful. And I thank you so much for your book, because you make it so readable that it's like reading a novel, but then I look at your footnotes, and your footnotes are incredible, but you put them in a very gentle way at the back. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And, you know, I wanted to kind of create two different books the one that I would want to read and that I hoped others would want to read, the narrative part. But then there's all the research that goes behind it. And I wanted it to read like a novel, so I'm glad it felt that way to you, but nothing is invented. So everything is sourced, and that does make for a lot of material back here, but also I hope provides an opening. I kind of conceived of this, the footnote section of the book as like the open source code. So you can go in there and you see where I got everything, and there's so much more that can also be done.
I have one simple question. Did she ever wear her disguise on her walk, on her tours?
No. In fact, one thing that I learned from, so there's a lot of wisdom to be gained from descendants of the Krafts, as well as other descendants. And so I've picked up these different stories from various family members, and the Kraft descendants have been especially amazing. But there are also the Ivanses. So there's a Quaker family who shelter the Krafts soon after they arrive in Pennsylvania. And it's from one of their descendants that I learned that I got evidence that Ellen Kraft, in fact, abandoned the clothing that she had worn as a disguise. I mean, there's that fear of being caught. There's that fear of being attached in any way to the South that she was leaving behind. So she left behind her clothes and then finally left behind the boots, which turned out to have spurs on them. So these spurred boots she gave to the Quaker family's son. So no, she did not have those actual clothes. Neither did she want to present herself in that way, because for her, there's a tremendous risk, because there was such a, the idea that a woman, not only that a Black woman would impersonate a white man, but just that she was crossing all of these different boundaries of class and race and gender. And to call attention to that and to sort of create excitement out of that would actually harm her. So in fact, when she was on the lecture circuit, she, just as much as she had to prove herself to be a man on the escape journey, she had to prove herself as a lady in the public eye.
So the lithograph, whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
of her in the outfit,
Mm-hmm.
what is that?
That's a close approximation from what I understand, but not the actual clothes. So they're pretty closely aligned, I think, with the descriptions that we have of the clothes that she wore on the journey, but they're not the actual clothes.
Hello.
Hello.
I wanted to know, since she's fair-skinned, is her husband fair-skinned too? And her story, when you first started, sort of reminds me of Jefferson, the president, how, sister, wife, aunts, they're too close, but they're all related. But yes, was he fair-skinned too? She's fair-skinned because she's posing as a man.
Yes.
And hearing from the first of it tonight, when did they die? And that's enough.
Yeah. So that's, again, a really interesting question, because Ellen Kraft has just been described as a quadroon, or of 1/4 African ancestry. William Kraft's ancestry is a little bit less clear. And we have from his own speech, evidence that he had 2 grandparents of full African ancestry. We don't know about the other 2, and so what his mixture was. But there are suggestions that he was also of mixed race, that he might have had some white ancestry as well. He's often described as mulatto, but his complexion was much darker.
Well, when did they die?
When did they die? So William, just about lived to see the 20th century. Ellen's death is unclear. We don't know exactly when she died. She asked to be buried on property that they owned at the time of her death.
They had moved back to the United States after the end of slavery, so they were down in the South.
And that's a whole nother part of the story. And she, so you can find more of the details here, but she was she and William created this educational and agricultural cooperative. And she had a favorite tree on that land. And she asked to be buried under that favorite tree. But unfortunately, the Krafts lost that land. So we don't know where that tree was and exactly where she lies. So there's kind of there's a sadness there. We know exactly where William Kraft is, but as they live together in life, in the end, they're buried apart.
It might be just since you bring up the Hemmingses, that now the Hemmings family and the Krafts family are connected.
They're entwined. So
Yeah.
one of the Krafts, so the Krafts descendants, there's one, a friend, Peggy Trotter Damond Priestley, and she has she's descended from the Krafts, also the Trotters, who are also famous for the William Monroe Trotter, James Monroe Trotter, who also fought in the Civil War, the Hemmingses, the Damonds. So all these lines come.
Just as a plug, Ilyon interviewed her. She's a friend, but Ilyon interviewed her, and that interview appears in Time magazine this week. So just as a plug.
Thank you. Yeah, because she is a former freedom writer, a poet, an activist. I mean, there's so many ways in which the Kraft descendants have and continue to live out their ancestors' legacy. The Krafts? Oh, they did. They had, so in my book, I have that they had 6, but I just learned through the Kraft family that there may have been a 7th who died, a daughter who died in England.
Hi, thank you for an amazing talk. I just wanted to ask, you touched on this a little bit with talking about Frederick Douglass, but I was kind of wondering, how did the Black community in Boston, both of free Black people, but of maybe other people who had escaped from slavery or were born free in Boston, how did they receive the Krafts? Because I can imagine if and I think this is something obviously that's even amplified in the modern day, but if the only stories getting press are these incredible stories to the point that people doubt if it's true, I was wondering how maybe other Black people in Boston would have thought that these people would have thought of the Krafts representing them.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So it's one of those situations where you don't have archival evidence of what everybody was thinking, but you do have, I think people on the whole, like we're very supportive. We're like standing with them, going to the various events, the speaking events, but also standing up together. Because for the Krafts to tell their story was really empowering for everyone. But you raise a good question, like having to do with the Black community in Boston and their involvement in the story, which is really, really important. And I think one thing I'd like to do is, especially because the Massachusetts Historical Society is so represented here archivally, is to point you to the end papers of this book. So I actually originally I'd wanted to have sort of the world of the Krafts on the outside of the book, but I actually like the fact that you have to kind of undress the book to get to this. And here you have a whole number of both Black and white activists who worked alongside or inspired the Krafts. And one that I want to bring particular attention to here is William Cooper Nell. So he's one of the unsung heroes of the Krafts Revolution. His picture is here at the Massachusetts Historical Society, along with a whole bunch of these. When I had to get the permissions for this, I was kind of like, do you have like a 2-for-1 deal on abolitionists? And because there's so many of them, but William Cooper Nell, he's one of these, he has an incredible story. And the irony is that he told so many other people's stories. He's considered one of the early historians. He wrote about colored patriots. He really he was a scholar, writer, journalist. He did so much, and he did so much behind the scenes. He was really the one, I mean, Bowditch is the one who sort of has this published story. It's Nell who is doing the major running behind the scenes. And he is so busy that he writes to one activist friend. He's saying, because she's saying, what's going on in Boston? He's like, it's crazy here. I could fill a book. I could fill volumes with what's going on, what I've seen. And he's like, but I got to run. And I'm thinking, oh, please come back. But he doesn't, unfortunately. So we have only this evocation of these volumes to know what his contributions might have been. We can imagine those things, but he doesn't tell them.
I mean, somebody who does figure prominently is Lewis Hayden right
Yes.
there.
Lewis Hayden, and not only him, but his wife Harriet, who is not sung as often as one of the heroes here, but they keep they're considered station masters on the Underground Railroad, and they have a house that's still here today, 66 Southwick Street, which is now Phillip Street. So you can see it and walk past it even now. It's a private home, but these places still stand, and it's said that there are tunnels under there through which they would have people escape.
So the Krafts stayed in his house at various times on that house. So if you go to that house on Phillip Street, 66 Phillip Street.
So it's kind of behind the State House on the north side.
And what was at that time the Black neighborhood of Boston. Yeah.
But there's so many people here, and I do honor them in the footnotes. And I'm trying to do right now is I just got on Instagram, and I am trying to post an activist a day for this month to honor some of the people who fought alongside William and Ellen.
Great. We have a question online from Elizabeth. She asks, when was their story written, and did they write it, or was it dictated to someone else?
Great question. Thank you. So it was written it was published in 1861. So written shortly before that. And I think one of the reasons why they waited for so long to tell their story is because they really wanted to be able to tell it themselves. In 1849, like soon after they had made this escape, there were others like Henry Box Brown, who had escaped the same year by packing himself into this like teeny tiny box and having himself mailed to freedom. So he actually comes out with his narrative soon after that, but he writes it with somebody. They didn't want to have any kind of ghostwriting situation. They wanted to be able to own their story, express it in their own terms. So it takes them a while for them to have the time to acquire the literacy and then have the time to write the story.
Their initial journey from Macon to Philadelphia is quite complicated. It's not just a matter of hopping on the Amtrak Palmetto. And they go in several places. They go from train to ship to another train. Things are canceled. Given the challenge of illiteracy, how did they map it out? Did they have help?
That's a great question. I mean, the thing is, they were supposed to go on the express. They were supposed to go from Macon to Savannah by train, step one. From Savannah to Charleston, step two. And then there was a steamer that went straight from Charleston to Philadelphia. They missed that boat. That's a problem because your only alternative is to go overland following the mails. And that's where you go local. I mean, like crazy local, like they're getting prodded and woke in the middle of the night to change vehicles. You don't know where you're going. So it's astounding that they're able to accomplish that. You can go to the American Antiquarian Society. I'm not sure if I looked at the guides here, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're here too, but you can find guidebooks and sort of schedules, like with the train schedules and the steamers. They're really complicated. They have these little fold up maps that they look like completely veined over. And, for a directionally challenged person like me, I'm like looking at this thing, like, how do you, where is this going? They didn't have that. They had none of these tools and they were able to find their way through. So it really is extraordinary. Yes.
In a way, you just answered my question, which was how did they actually make the journey, the original journey from Georgia to Philadelphia? And it sounds as though they did it through trains and ships, et cetera.
Yes. So they were on steamboats. They were on the actual railroad, no underground railroad. They rode omnibuses. They took a fly, like this, like super fast little carriage. I mean, they were on basically, this is a time of transportation revolution. It's, industrial revolution, information revolution, transportation revolution, and they're riding all of these in their journey to freedom.
We have another question online from Greg who asks, can you tell me what happens once they get to England?
I don't think there's a short story for that, because they spend almost 20 years in England, essentially in exile, because they can't come back. They're still just as vulnerable until after the Civil War. And they make other choices. During the Civil War, William actually does consider coming back. He wants to fight, but instead he ends up going to West Africa. And he goes to Dahomey, and he tries to convince the king there. He goes on a business trip to try to convert the economy from a slave-based economy to cotton growing or palm oil and such. And he opens a school there. Ellen Kraft, meanwhile, she's raising their numerous children, their growing family. She's also, it's actually really neat to read about how she's making, like, once the Emancipation Proclamation passes, she's trying to follow where her mother is behind the lines. She's also sewing and using her own industry and craft to create things, wearable items for people newly released when that opportunity comes. So they're doing a lot from abroad and in England. What my book covers, though, is the first part of that, when they are, again, on this incredible lecture circuit, very different from what they were on before in New England, as they're playing to much different and bigger crowds.
So I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. We have books for sale in the lobby. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's joining us online. And I hope that they'll go to Amazon or Bookshop and purchase this book as well. Thank you very much.